all eyes of the world will be on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I cannot wait to smash Anthony Joshua. See you all in Saudi!
Hello and welcome to The Nexus. That was the heavyweight boxing champion Tyson Fury talking about his upcoming fight with Anthony Joshua in Saudi Arabia. All fight fans were really looking forward to it, but for contractual reasons, the fight's been called off. Turns out that Fury is obliged to fight Deontay Wilder for a third time before he can face Joshua. This is all a huge disappointment for fight fans, but for some human rights campaigners, it's a good thing that the fight's not going ahead. They accuse Saudi of using the fight, indeed sporting events in general, to cover up the country's poor human rights record, a process known as sportswashing. Now, whether that's true or not, it wouldn't be the first time a top fight has been held in a dictatorship. Remember the Rumble in the Jungle? 1974, and dictator Mobutu Sese Seko paid millions to bring Muhammad Ali and George Foreman to what was then known as Zaire. Well, we'll discuss all of this with our guests in a moment, but first, let's take a closer look at the case against Saudi Arabia. Whether it's boxing, Formula One, or even golf, sport at the highest level can be thrilling and a lot of fun. And in the past few years, since Mohammed bin Salman effectively became leader of Saudi Arabia, Saudis have been able to enjoy some of the really top-flight events, including Joshua versus Ruiz in 2019, the Dakar Rally, and later this year, Formula One. Saudis no doubt enjoy these spectacles, but for the Saudi government, they hope it will not only distract its population, but distract its critics from its human rights record. The kingdom has spearheaded an intervention in Yemen, part of a war that has killed over 100,000 people, including at least 12,000 civilians. Observers estimate that at least two-thirds of these deaths were caused by Saudi Arabia's aggressive campaign of airstrikes. A recent declassified US intelligence report named MBS as ultimately responsible for the brutal murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. And several women's rights activists were jailed just weeks before lifting the driving ban in the country. Now, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has managed to stage some massive prestige sporting events in recent times, but the kingdom doesn't always get its way. Tiger Woods and Rory McIlroy are among sports stars that have turned down millions of dollars offered to them by Saudi.
I think you all know my feelings on it, and I'm very much against it, and I don't see why, I don't see why anyone would be for it.
And here's another example. After a prolonged process, the Saudi-backed consortium's attempt to buy Newcastle United Football Club failed due to pressure from a wide-ranging coalition, including Amnesty International, the World Trade Organization, and the fiancé of the murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and the human rights group Grant Liberty, which has detailed the experiences of over 300 prisoners of conscience in the MBS era. It also recently issued this report about Saudi Arabia's so-called sportswashing. They say Saudi Arabia shouldn't be allowed to host such events while being so oppressive. Well, as we just heard, Saudi Arabia is trying to launch a new Golf Super League, a breakaway competition designed to lure the world's best players away from the PGA and European tours for big bucks. Of course, as we've heard, Rory McIlroy has come out strongly against the idea, but some golfers are very much looking forward to it.
The fact that somebody could come up to you at 48, where you are today, and offer you $50 million, or maybe come up to you 2 years
done
earlier.
That yet.
What's that?
Is this it?
Well, I'm sure the Saudis would let me be the agent here if they're necessary. But,
right.
But the question is is it hard, not necessarily you, but anybody, hard to turn that down?
For me, at 50, it's a no-brainer. Nearly 50, it's a no-brainer, isn't it?
Well, human rights groups have spoken out strongly against Saudi Arabia's recent big sporting events. Human Rights Watch, for example, says it is part of a cynical strategy to distract from Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses, detention and torture of human rights defenders, and women's rights activists. Amnesty International, meanwhile, says with critics of the government either jailed, exiled, or hounded into silence, the Saudi authorities have pursued a twin-track approach of crushing human rights while throwing large amounts of money at glittering sporting events. And it's not just human rights groups. Let's hear from the sister of a Saudi dissident who was jailed for posting tweets which were negative towards the kingdom.
So using sport events and entertainment to basically sell an image, a certain image that Saudi Arabia is becoming more open and modern and more welcoming, but in reality, there's all this oppression going on underneath all these glorious and, sparkling events.
Now, despite all of those concerns that we've just heard, it's worth noting that when asked in a BBC interview if he had any moral or ethical concerns about fighting in Saudi Arabia, Anthony Joshua dismissed such concerns, saying it was just a boxing opportunity and that everything seemed to be okay to him.
Do you think by coming somewhere like this, you're in some way forfeiting your status as a role model and your legacy in the future may be affected?
Not necessarily. I just come here for the boxing opportunity, and I feel like taking boxing globally is what a world champion or a challenger should be doing, because it's like you fight around the world. So I look around and everyone seems pretty chilled and happy. I'm not seeing anyone in a negative light out here. Everyone seems to be having a good time and chilling out behind us. So yeah, it's a positive thing.
Now, while willing to turn a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses, he's been very vocal about civil rights in Britain. Here he is addressing a Black Lives Matter rally last summer in London.
We can no longer sit back and remain silent on the senseless, unlawful killings, sly racism of another human being based only on what? Their skin colour.
Well, Lewis Hamilton also in the spotlight, the Formula One racing driver. Dozens of human rights organisations have written to him, asking him to reconsider participating in the Grand Prix that's scheduled to take place in Jeddah in December. They refer to the detention of women's rights activists, the war in Yemen, and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in their letter. Like Joshua, Lewis Hamilton, who is worth $280 million, has been very vocal about civil rights in Britain. As far as we know, Lewis Hamilton is still participating in the race scheduled for later this year. OK, let's bring in our guest now. Top left there, we have Lucy Ray from the human rights group Grant Liberty, which you just heard about in that report. Simon Chadwick is a professor of Eurasian sport at EM Lyon Business School. Naja Al-Otaibi is a Saudi political analyst and a trustee at the Saudi British Society, which focuses on promoting good relations between UK and Saudi Arabia. And finally, Bigani Zama is a South African journalist and author who writes about sport in the apartheid era. Thank you all for joining us, much appreciated. I'd like to start with you, Naja. The question really here for this programme is Saudi Arabia guilty of sports washing? And is it a worthy venue for these top sporting events?
Well, this is an interesting question. Saudi Arabia indeed has invested a lot of money in organizing sporting events over the last few years. And I think this is purely for economic reason and also for to push the modernization plan that Saudi Arabia now is doing. As you may know, Saudi Arabia is now trying to diversify its economy away from oil. This would need the country to develop new industries to generate money. Sport is an excellent way of generating this, diversifying the economy and generating more money. And that is why the kingdom has invested a lot of money on that. The other reason is, Saudi Arabia wants to modernize its society. For long, this country has been a very conservative Islamic country where women were not allowed to drive or even to attend the sporting event. I lived all my life in Saudi Arabia. My generation, we couldn't even pick up a sport because sports were banned. Saudi Arabia wants to change that culture, wants to invite young girls and young boys to engage in sports and be part of our culture. So that is why they are investing all these energy and money.
Okay. Let me put that point to Lucy Ray. Lucy, far from being a sports washing technique, Saudi Arabia is using these big events in order to modernise the country and to diversify the economy.
Yeah, every country is welcome to diversify their economy. But within the regime and the modernization of the country, that also is not a synthetic change. It needs to be a real change for the human rights activists that are currently being held within prisons. You've still got 3 female human rights activists who campaigned for the right to drive. And yet that law has now been rescinded. And for example, the Dakar rally goes within miles of the prisons that these women are currently being held in. And if the regime wants to be modern and accepted in a modern society, they have to back this up with their stance and change their policy against human rights activists.
Lucy, do you think then that Saudi Arabia should be deprived of the right to host these events until they meet the standards that you're referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. These events are supported and followed by millions globally. And these sporting individuals are heroes and are looked up to by people. So for the country to be able to host these events and for sporting stars to allow their brands and endorsements within that country, they have to change their policies on how they treat people within their own country.
Naja, Saudi Arabia has modernised, but not enough to be worthy of hosting these kinds of sports events.
Well, I don't see a connection between the two. Why politicalizing sport? So there are, of course, some issues, some policies that Saudi Arabia might need to develop, but maybe there are different channels to approach. Why do we involve sport? Look at Saudi Arabia's population, for example. It's a young population. 30% of the population is under 35 years. These people are hungry for sport. They want to see the stars. They want to be part of this world. They have nothing to do with politics. So sport should be away from politics. There are other channels, diplomacy. You approach the government through diplomacy, but it's irrational. From human rights organizations, if they're supporting human rights, they should support the right of people in Saudi Arabia to engage in sport and be part of this culture.
The point there with the young population wanting sports within those countries, but the young population globally also want change within human rights laws, i.e. the Black Lives Matter, that was a global phenomenon. Young people are calling for change, and sport is followed and has such a mass following that, for example, with the boycott in South Africa that led to a global movement and change and helped to push that question of apartheid and only reinstated once apartheid finished. The two can go hand in hand because there's such strong opinions on both.
Simon, I'd just like to bring you in. I know you've been in the room, so to speak, with Saudis and with other high-ranking people who have been sort of planning the economy for the country. And you've said in your experience you've never seen it being a sort of premeditated motive for bringing big sporting events there.
I'm not going to say it doesn't exist. I've got a very pragmatic view of all of this. However, going back to Naja's first point, very often the conversation starts with discussions about economic development, about sociocultural issues. I do take issue with what Naja said. Unfortunately, sport and politics do go together. So very often conversations about sport are framed in terms of politics. And what we know is that sport is incredibly powerful. We know it has the power to change narratives about countries. It has the power to confer a particular image upon countries. I think for me, the whole issue of sport washing, what we need to do is really need to understand it better. There's very little research about it, about how it works, about how it changes people's attitudes and behaviors towards a country. So I kind of sit in the middle on this for the time being in terms of, I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but I think we need to understand how sport washing or the accusation of sport washing actually works in practice.
And as an academic, you've mentioned in the past that you don't see any serious research or evidence that points to the existence of sports washing in Saudi Arabia's case.
Well, I think what's really interesting is rather than sport washing, I prefer to use the word sport staining, because in reality, maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, we all wouldn't be sat here now talking about Saudi Arabian sport and sport washing. But the Saudi Arabian government has chosen to invest in sport, so now we're all talking about it. And I think if sport washing is an attempt to deflect attention or to cleanse the image of a country, we've seen many, many times across the world in recent years, it simply doesn't work, because in reality, it shines a spotlight upon countries. And I'm not just talking about Saudi Arabia here. There are other countries as well where this has happened. And so rather than using this what I think in some ways is a very lazy label, we need to understand through research and through a consensus of understanding what exactly is happening across countries and how they use sport to divert attention away from whatever it is that country is seeking to achieve.
That's a very interesting point about how, if anything, it actually brings additional attention to the country. For example, Qatar 2022. But the problem is, Naja, is that people like Lucy, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, Saudi dissidents, all say that Saudi Arabia cannot stand up to this additional scrutiny, and that if you separate out the enormous amount of money they're putting on the table, what you see behind that is still a very poor track record.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning something that we always see in the media, that situation of human rights in Saudi Arabia is the worst and everything. But let's have a closer look to the situation now. Over the last 4 years, human rights situation has improved like we have never seen it improved in the way it was, in terms of women's rights, in terms of freedom of religion, education reform. All these things are taking place hand in hand with organizing a sporting event or reforming society or reforming the economy. They're all together completing each other. So it's not that Saudi is organizing these events just to cover up something. They're not covering up. They are actually working to develop human rights, to reform the society. But everything needs time. Saudi Arabia is 80 years old only, and they have only started this modernization issue and tackling these universal values and changing the culture. It takes time.
Lucy, do you buy that argument? It takes time?
I think, Naja, in terms of the country having made progress and reforms, only a few weeks ago we had Abdul Rahman Al Sudan prisoned for 20 years for running a Twitter account. It's not acceptable. You still have over 300 prisoners of conscience within Saudi Arabian jails. You've got Sama Badawi, you've got Maya al-Zanari, you've got Nasima al-Sadar, who all suffered abuse and torture and are imprisoned for the right to drive and are still currently there. You've got family members that many of us within the human rights organisations liaise with and are frightened to speak out for fear of retribution for family members, for them not being able to leave the country. And for just a few weeks ago, when someone is, sentenced to 20 years for running a Twitter account, the reforms are not happening quick enough. They don't go far enough.
Lucy, thank you for that. We're just going to turn to the example of South Africa now. Not so long ago, it was essentially cut out of global sporting events to stop the government from sports washing, in a way, its apartheid regime. Throughout the 1960s, 70s and 80s and 90s, most South African sporting teams were banned from global competition. Foreign teams were generally ordered not to go there. Well, let's speak to Lugani Zama now, as we introduce him at the top of the programme, a South African journalist and author who's written extensively on the subject. Joins us from Johannesburg. Lugani, thank you very much for your patience here. Now that we're in the South Africa section of the programme, let's explore what the sort of sporting sanctions did to the South African government all those decades ago. Why was it important to get them to change?
Look, I think it was absolutely imperative that the international community stood up against South Africa and boycotted coming to this country, because I don't know if you could call it sport washing at that time, but essentially it wasn't a real South Africa. It wasn't a representation of the whole population. And I think that's the danger with hosting these sports events in countries where there are massive injustices on the human rights of people for the sake of entertainment. So I think one of the big questions that you've got to ask is pricking the moral conscience of these sports stars. Lewis Hamilton stood up strongly for Black Lives Matter, as did Anthony Joshua in the midst of a pandemic. We saw them marching down streets in London and really making statements. So for those same people to essentially turn a blind eye to human rights in a country where they're happy to compete for millions, it's sadly ironic, in fact, astonishing. And I think from a South African perspective, it was needed. The sanctions were needed because the country needed to be unified, and people needed to have a voice, not just be citizens and enslaved and kept to their corners and vastly segregated. And I think the ramifications of the apartheid era are still felt today. And I think that's why the international community is standing up against what Saudi Arabia is perceived to be doing. We can't be experts because we don't live there, but when you know the human rights track record and you know that the money being spent probably entertains the very privileged few when you look at the bigger picture of the population, and it doesn't really change the daily lives of those people whose rights have been restricted for a very long time. The South African example tells you that the entertainment of a few cannot come at the cost of the injustice to so many, and we live that legacy to this day. The injustices might no longer be there, but the ramifications are still being felt.
What did it do for the morale of the people fighting the apartheid regime to know that many countries around the world wanted to sort of enforce a sports boycott on the South African government?
I think it meant everything. If you speak to sports stars of that generation, if you speak to politicians of that generation, they get emotional talking about it, because for the longest time they assumed that the world just didn't care, that they turned this blind eye and everything continued, and there were some South Africans who were perceived to be global athletes and competing out there when at the very flag that they represent actually represents something far more sinister. So to know that the international community was watching and was making a noise to the point where you're banned from Olympics and you're banned from international competition, it emboldens your fight, because you're fighting for something that the world recognizes. And I think, we live in 2021, human rights are, they're rights, they're not human privileges, they're rights. You should have freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of choice. And to be in 2021 where you're still scared to put out a tweet or go to Google or, do all the things that we take for granted, be on Skype like we are now, it shouldn't be that way. And I think that's why people raise these flags of concern for countries who are perceived to be, entertaining the privileged few who can afford, to sit at these races or watch these golf tournaments, when meantime, everyday life is vastly different for the rest of the population.
Of course, there were some exceptions. We had some rebel tours going to South Africa. How were those people judged by the vast majority of South Africans? And how do you think history will judge the athletes who end up going to, let's say, Saudi Arabia, but other countries as well, where human rights is under the spotlight, should we say?
I'll speak specifically on the West Indies rebel team that came in the 80s. And for the purposes of apartheid, they were incredibly given honorary white status while they were here. These are black athletes with African roots. And in order to come and compete and make as if South Africa is quite normal and black people can coexist with white people, they were given honorary white status. And some of those West Indies in later years, some of those players were almost suicidal when they realized what they did. And I think, sometimes your financial needs at the time and your responsibilities as a young man or woman whose livelihood is made through sport, it sometimes blinds you to the bigger picture. But when you look at it and when history looks at it, it's a stain that you can't wash off. And I think that's why it's so disappointing to see so many prominent voices in sport turning a blind eye, as it would, and taking the millions that are on offer now. And in the meantime, they're telling us to listen to them when they talk about Black Lives Matter and giving dignity to people of all races and wherever they come from. But in this instance, we must forget the example that they said that we must follow from them when they go to countries where you know for a fact that just down the road from these glittering sporting halls, there are people who can't even come out really and watch, or haven't been allowed to come out and watch. You know, so it's terribly sad.
Lugani Zama, Najah Al-Otaibi, Simon Chadwick and Lucy Ray, thank you all very much for your contributions to The Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this or any of our previous episodes again, just go to our channel on YouTube, type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.